Hi there, this is of course Tamara Tabo, and in this video I'm going to be sharing a little bit with you about how I created the online responsive survey instruments that we'll be using during faculty interviews for our curriculum mapping project at the law school. In a separate video I demonstrated what the survey instrument looks like for the end user, for the interviewer. I also described some of the rationale for why I wanted to create this electronic instrument instead of just using a conventional paper form or long paper script. And then I also demonstrated some of those back-end features to the survey instrument, so the data collection, the spreadsheet collection, all that good stuff. So that's in a separate video. What I want to do here now is demonstrate some of the mechanics of how one goes about creating a survey like this. And for this project, I used one of my favorite, very simple, extremely flexible creation tools, namely Google Forms. I'm a huge fan of the Forms function, the Forms app in Google Drive and available in Google Apps. So what I'm going to be showing you is all based in Google Forms, but I'm going to show you the method that I use for making a truly responsive instrument like the one that we ended up using for our faculty interviews. So let's get started without further ado, and I will kind of show you around how I made this survey. So I created the entire interview instrument, the entire survey instrument in the Google Forms app available for free in Google Drive. And Google Forms and Google Drive are just available with a free Google account or with a Google Apps for Education account for schools that use Google Apps for Education. But everything I'll be doing is just a simple and free tool available online in Google Forms. So in order to create the end product, the end live form that I demonstrated in the last video, where the interviewer is able to just sort of click on responses and choose drop-down menus, yes, no, multiple choice, those sorts of things, and then be directed to a different page and a different sequence of pages depending upon what the response is that they're clicking. So for example, here when we answered yes to that previous question, you're taken to this page, whereas if on this same question we'd answered no and clicked continue, we would go to a different page. And it sort of turns into a bit of a choose your own adventure survey. So it's not just simply a linear form, but it branches out in an enormous number of permutations, a nearly infinite number of permutations out here. In order to create this end product that's going to be usable for an interviewer, we need to kind of sketch out in even just mentally what the flow of the pages or the questions would be and what the logic behind that is. It's almost sort of like designing circuitry in computers or a decision tree in logic. So it does actually require some pretty intense thinking before you get to the point that you're actually creating the form and long before you get to this finished product here. So for our curriculum mapping project group, our working group, when we first started thinking about how we wanted to be conducting these faculty interviews that we would be using to gather data, we're thinking in terms of a conversation. We wanted it to be very organic. We wanted there to be a script that all of the interviewers would be following so that there would be consistency and among the questions that are being asked, and therefore, some reliability to the responses that we're recording. But we also were choosing to do interviews in order to keep an organic and natural conversation going. So one of the things when first started thinking about how we were going to conceptualize this script and actually turn it into sort of a proper survey instrument was just really beginning to think about the logic behind how an organic conversation would flow, right? So kind of started by mapping out, graphing out sort of, what you might say, and depending upon what the person's response is, what would you say next? And initially, when we first started thinking in terms of this flow chart, in order to create the script, I actually initially started working in Lucidchart on actually a sort of proper flow chart version of what our script might be. So this is an example of a draft that I was doing with critical reasoning skills. Now, one of the things that made this tricky, even though it was sort of a useful brainstorming step, was some of the logistical concerns about including all of the text on one page without having it be too small, making sure that there was plenty of room for recording responses. So even though charting things out for all of the questions and all of the modules in flowchart form turned out to be really, really useful for some of my own thinking, I don't think that this was the right way for our end product to appear. So that's why I started thinking about other ways that we might take this basic concept of logical flow and turn it into a more user-friendly instrument. So once I started to have a sense of how I would want the natural logical progression in a conversation or an interview to proceed, I went to Google Drive and created a new form. So if you're in Google Drive, you would just click New and go to Google Forms. And this is the default screen that you always see in Google Forms, of course. So in Google Forms, of course, you have the option to title the form. You're entering a series of questions along with help text as well. You have your choice of different types of questions that you might create, whether it's short text, paragraph text, multiple choice, checkboxes, etc., etc. And I won't attempt to demonstrate, of course, the full functionality of Google Forms at this point, but just to point out sort of generally what that blank interface looks like. And then, of course, you can always choose whether or not a question is required in order for someone to submit a response in order for them to proceed. And then you can continue adding additional items, as well as adjust things like section headers, add images or videos, and very importantly for our purposes today, you can add page breaks. And when you create a new page, you have the option of titling that new page, if you like, and giving a descriptive text. But what becomes really important when we get into the design of a responsive form like this, a responsive survey like this, is setting those page breaks is going to be what allows you to separate out responses. For example, the yes/no responses. You're going to tell Google Forms to take the viewer to one page if the answer is yes, and to another page if the answer is no, for example, as I'll show you in a moment. But setting those page breaks is going to be sort of how you create these sort of logical nodes in your overall flow chart. So that's always going to be extremely important. So this demonstrates one of the several modules in the overall curriculum mapping survey that I created in Google Forms. And I decided, just for a variety of pragmatic reasons, to separate out each of the modules, each of the areas of competency that we were going to be looking at in the overall project, separate them out into different forms documents, though you could conceivably do the same thing all in one document. But so this is an example of what I ended up with the professional identity module. And so you've created, of course, a title. This is just descriptive text. Here's an example of, sort of the first question that you designed, because you can create those scalar rating. Enter the question text, and then among the options that you have is choose from a list as well as multiple choice. And those are going to be two question types that are going to allow you to go to a page based on an answer. So you'll check that, and then you enter your answer choices. It can be as many as you like. So I mean, you could have 12 different responses here. It need not be simply yes, no. But for the purposes of this particular question, there was a yes. And so what I set, of course, among the options here was question 1. So if question 1 is yes, then that's the page it'll go to. And then likewise with a no response, I chose go to page 2, which I titled if no to question 1. So you continue to make pages of questions. This is a new page, right? I created a page break here. And on each page, there's going to be at least one question that is a go to page based on answer question. And typically, though not always, I make that sort of that trigger question be the final question before my next page break. So in the example on this page, the last question was, and it's obviously not actually a question, but it's technically a question for the purposes of the design of the form, is saying, okay, we'll move on to the next area unless you have anything to add. And the option that I chose was moving on to the next module, and submitting the form is one of the directions that you can send the viewer. And so that's what I selected there. And you continue, of course, all the way through your survey, all of the questions that you might want to include. In this particular module of our survey, there are 14 pages worth of questions, and I think around 50, 60 individual items that are possible to be asked. But of course, part of the idea of a responsive form is we want to avoid duplicative questioning during the actual interview. So it's certainly not the case that every interviewee will be exposed to all, say, 60 of those question items. In fact, the whole idea is that there will probably be a fairly large number of those for any given interviewee that they're never exposed to, because the logic of the system is already determined based on their previous response that they don't need to be asked those items. So going back to the blank Google Forms document. So this is sort of the design side when you're first creating your form. Let me run through sort of a demonstration of what the basic method is here. So I'm going to just name our instrument here demo. Doesn't really matter. You can enter a description if you like, but you don't need to. You'll add your first item. And so this is just going to be the first question that your users are going to encounter. And for the purposes of a clear demo here, I'm just going to make our question A, right? No more complicated than that. And I am going to create a question that chooses from a list. You can do it with multiple choice or other types of questions too. And then I'm also going to click go to page based on answer. If you don't click on this option for a given question, then your user will just simply see the next question in the sequence. So it'll just go straight through the form, the survey, in a completely linear fashion. And for many of your questions, that's exactly what you want. But for any of these trigger questions that are going to potentially trigger a break in the flow, they're going to be sort of a splitting on our flow chart, we'll want to click go to page based on answer. So you're entering your question answers here, your options, and they can be, you know, sentence long, paragraph long, yes, no, binary. There can be as many options as you like. You can have 12 different options listed. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to create yes and no. And when you've created an option and you're going to go to a page based on the answer, you're given this drop-down menu. And continue to the next page is going to be something that is going to take your respondent to the next page that you create in the survey, in the form, regardless of whether or not this question is maybe, say, the last one on the page. So it's going to route them automatically just onto the next page in the sequence. You're going to have, and I'll show you this in a moment, you're going to have the option of going to any of the pages that you've already created in the form. And I'll show you that momentarily. And then you're always given the option of taking your respondent to the submit form screen. So the submit form screen is just that final screen that your user sees, and they're able to click that blue submit button that sends all the data in and ends the survey. And that's always going to be an option too. And you're going to have the same options in the drop-down menu for each of your responses. And if you have multiple responses, if you have 3 or 4 choices, you can certainly have, say, 2 out of 3 choices send your user to one page, and then one of those choices send your user to another. So once again, you can kind of map out logically where it is that you would want, what it is that you would want your user to see next based on their response. So here's where you really begin to get into that conceptualization element. You need to know where it is you want your user to go, what it is that you want them to see, before you actually complete the drafting of a given question. Because in order to send your user to a different page, you need to have created that page already. So one of the options that you always have when you are kind of creating a new item is you can create, after any question or any number of questions, you can create a page break. And again, that could be after a single question, or you could insert a page break after 500 questions. It's immaterial to forms. But when you create a new page, you'll be given the option of naming the page. And this is just sort of a header. Now, I think that in a lot of cases, if you want to kind of keep this clean from a design end, it's really useful to name the page, or at least give a description for the page that is something that you don't mind the user seeing, but that is also very instructive to you in terms of design. So I may title our second page "If Yes to A," or "If Yes to Question A." Okay? And all I've done is created a page. I haven't created any questions on that page yet. So let me go ahead and add one question, one item here on this new page. And we'll call this question, question B. And this time I'm doing a multiple choice question, but I'm still going to be able to do the go to page based on answer. And the difference between choose from a list and multiple choice is um, essentially there are a few functions in terms of how many choices someone can select and things like that that are different, but same basic idea. So let me create yes, no, and maybe responses here. And then I'm also going to have the go to page based on answer. And now you'll be able to see that the drop down menu here is going to, as always, include continue to next page and submit form. But it's also going to list as options both of the two pages that exist in the form. So our first one is the go to page one. It's that demo page, right? And then the second option is go to page two. And our second page, of course, was titled If Yes to Question A. So it's going to be put in parentheses here. So those are both going to be options that we now have. Now, I think that to some extent it is easier to kind of map out most of your pages before you actually do those settings for continuing to pages. So bear with me here. Let's create another page break. Now remember, you could put more than one question on this page, but for simplicity's sake, let's do a new page that is if no to question A. Okay? And then let's put question C in here. Just to show that they don't all have to be yes/no answers. So if you notice what I just did, question A on our first page is going to go to a page depending upon whether the respondent answers yes, or to a different page if the respondent answers no. So I'm going to select as my location for question A. For the yes, I'm going to pick the page that I've titled If Yes to Question A. And for question A, if someone answers no, I'm going to select as my location the page that I have titled, this is page 3, that I've titled If No to Question A, right? Pretty sensible, huh? So if someone said yes to question A, then they're going to be taken to question B down here on this page. Remember our separate page. And they're going to be given their options. And if they answer no, what they're going to see next is question C, right? So they're not going to see this. They're going to go to the if no if question A. Now, let's say that our user selected yes. So they're now taken to question B. And let's go back to editing question B. Well, they're going to be asked a question, and they are going to be responding yes, no, or maybe to this question. And they are going to be sent to different pages depending upon which of those options they choose, right? So, once again, we can now choose among all of these different pages because we have page 3 there. So you might want anyone who answered yes to question B, say it's some sort of logical follow-up, what you want them to see next is the same thing that you would have wanted someone to see if they had said no to question A. So maybe you're going to set that. And let's say this is, question B here is just a deal breaker. If somebody says no, that means that we're going to just ask them to submit the form, and it's going to be end of that survey, end of the module. Well, what about for maybe? These are our options right now, but let's say, and this is where, once again, you have to think about creating these pages that go along with the logical flow of the conversation you're hoping to have. Let's say that for maybe, there is going to be yet another place that we want them to go. So let's go down here and create another page, right? So after page 3, we're going to add a page break. And this is going to be titled, If Maybe to Question, and that was question C, right? Oh, no, question B. Okay. And so now, let's create a question on this page, and we'll call it question D. And a bunch of different options here for how someone might respond to question D, right? So now that we've created this new page, now we can go back up to question B, and we can, for the selection maybe, we can choose go to page 4, if maybe to question B, right? So that's where they're going to go. And so if folks answer if maybe to question B, they're going to be routed automatically to page 4, where they're going to see question D. Question D is going to have these 4 different choices, and we might choose to have someone who answers blue go to submit form. But for these other options, we might want them to go to different pages. So let me show just a few more options here. So let's see, and it doesn't actually even have to be. Oops. So now that we've created a couple of different options, new pages that represent possible answers to question D, we can go back to question D. And let's say we wanted both blue and purple to be the end of the game. But for someone who responds indigo, we want them to go to the page titled If Indigo to question D, right? And violet, we want them to go to If Violet to question D, right? So I'll show you just a few more possibilities here in the basic method. Let's go to question E, which was the page that someone would end up on if they had answered violet to question D, where they had blue, purple, indigo, violet as options. So they're routed to if violet to question D, and let's say that we're going to go to page based on answer. And we've got some options here. Remember that it is always possible that in a subsequent question, you will want to sort of circle back on one of the previous pages in the instrument that either is a question that the interview subject had answered before, but you want them to now answer it again, revisit that same question, or it might be something that a particular interviewer followed a sequence based on their responses, followed a sequence of questions that skipped over a question, and now you want to ask them that question. So you didn't want to ask them before, but now you do, right? Because your conversation has sort of organically moved, logically moved to the point that this is now the appropriate question. So you can always pick any of these pages as the place that you're going to take your subject. So we might have question E be something that actually takes you all the way back to page 2, to that question where someone who had originally answered yes to question A would have seen. And then we might have someone answering no, actually move on to the same question that someone who had answered differently in the previous question would see. So roughly what that would mean is someone had been looking at D, they're either going to end, they're going to submit the form if they answer blue or purple. If somebody answers indigo to this question, they're going to go down here, right? And we'll work on that question in a moment. But if they had answered question D with violet, then they'll be taken to question E here, and they're going to be given that question. And if they answer yes to that question, then they're going to go all the way back up to one of those initial questions, the if yes to question A. And if they answer no here, so they answered question D, violet, then they answered no to question E, then that's going to take them to indigo, the same page that they would have seen if they had answered indigo to question D. And logically, you can sort of imagine how a given pattern might sort of branch out this way. So let's finish this up with a question here for if indigo to question D. Now, we'll make this question F. This time I'm going to make the question format, the question type, be a paragraph text instead of multiple choice or choose from a list or some of those options that we've been working with before. Now, once again, without getting into all of the different functions of Google Drive, you can imagine how sort of at the end of all of these objective questions that you're asking your interview subject, where you're getting yes, no responses or multiple choice responses, you might sort of be ending the interview with something more open-ended or something narrative, where the question you're going to be asking is going to be something that you're going to essentially take notes on their response, but there is no preset response. Now, you can of course do this, and that's how we're going to end our little mock survey here. But do note that paragraph text is one of the question types that does not allow you to route your user to different pages based on their response. Now that only makes sense, right? Of course, the program, Google Forms, is only able to route one way or another when there is a single response that a user could give that would be so routed, right? If they're giving a paragraph length answer, there's no simple way for the computer to know what types of answers, unless it's actually word for word an entire paragraph, that's going to require routing in one direction or another. So it's really not a manageable option, for good reason. So you might end your survey with paragraph text, but this is going to be either the very end of the survey, which is what we're going to do here, or you know that when your user answers this question, what they're going to be sent to next is another question or another page that's just in sequence in your form. So it's not that this has to be the last question, it's just that there is only one sequence that a user can follow after this question. Everyone is going to go to the same place after providing their response to question F, whereas with our other questions, we were having users giving different responses going to different pages. So that is the difference here. And so this is sort of an example that we just created. And as always in Google Forms, you can actually do some aesthetic manipulations too. So you can create different themes, for example, and do some design elements there, change fonts, that sort of thing. But let's take a look at the live form version of what we just created. So here's our title. Here's question A. And of course, this would be question text. So presumably it would make sense to be answering yes or no. But so what happens when someone answers no to question A and clicks continue? They go to the page, if no to question A. And they're going to look at question C and they're going to decide apples. They click continue. Question B. Submit. If they had answered yes to question A, they're going to go a different place. Oranges. And remember, this is the option where we said if they choose blue or purple, it's going to take them to the submit. It's going to end the survey. But if they chose violet, then, and this was going to loop us all the way back. If they had answered no, they're going to be able to give us that narrative response and then hit submit. And the basic idea here, of course, is that there are innumerable permutations that a given end user might experience when they're actually interacting with the final live form. And that's, of course, the whole idea to creating all of these sort of logical nodes within the survey document, as opposed to just having it be completely linear and sequential. And as I described in the last video, demonstrating the user experience and describing the rationale of creating our survey instrument this way, one of the wonderful things about using using Google Forms to do this is automatically all of the data that is collected when folks press submit is automatically going to be added to a spreadsheet, a pre-formatted spreadsheet in Google Forms that's marked responses. So we just did a demo form, and now it's going to be viewable in demo responses. And so, of course, you have, in addition to the timestamp for when the person pressed submit, you have as headings for columns, you have each of your questions. And this actually includes the full question text. Again, we just have these nice little abbreviations for our demo, but it would be the actual question that you ask. And then the responses that each person gave for each of those questions. Since in the case of these more complicated responsive surveys, they're invariably going to be, and in fact by design, going to be questions that a particular interviewee, a particular subject never gets asked, right? We're trying to avoid duplicative questions, so there will necessarily be some that they are not asked. Then there's simply going to be a blank in that portion of the spreadsheet. But for everything else, it is going to record whatever response they selected, including for the paragraph text or text responses, anything that you record there, whether it's a few words or whether it's a few paragraphs. It's all going to be included there. And so that's, of course, one of the really great things about using forms to create a survey of this sort, is for all of that logical morass that you have to plod your way through when you're designing the survey instrument, as we just were, you get this wonderful organized spreadsheet that automatically collects your data from the submissions. So that is a tour of the mechanics of creating the instrument that I created for the purposes of our curriculum mapping project at the law school. Again, that's just kind of a step through of how Google Forms allows this sort of responsive survey to be created. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer either technical questions about how I created the form, or give you more information about what our overall project was like, or show you what the end user experience is like. And you